why is space still a disarmament issue today? I think before answering that question, it's important to tackle another question, which is, what are the current instruments that we have for regulating weapons in space today? And to answer that question, I can tell you that there is one main space treaty that constitutes the basis for all space law, both international and domestic. And that is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, or OST for short. This is the most relevant treaty for space security, but there are the 4 international space treaties that also were enacted during those first years of space exploration. First, there is the 1968 Rescue and Return Agreement. There is also the 1972 Liability Convention, the 1976 Registration Convention, and the 1984 Moon Agreement. And although all of these treaties seek to establish outer space as a domain to be used for peaceful purposes, it is the OST that establishes a prohibition against the use of weapons. Actually, this prohibition is also echoed by the Moon Agreement, but I'm going to focus on the Outer Space Treaty because it's the most widely accepted of all of these treaties that I mentioned. So under Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty, states parties undertake not to place in orbit around the Earth any objects carrying nuclear weapons or any other kinds of weapons of mass destruction, install such weapons on celestial bodies, or station such weapons in outer space in any other manner. This article also forbids the testing of any types of weapons and the conduct of military maneuvers on celestial bodies. The outer space doesn't really provide further clarification regarding the placement of conventional weapons in outer space, nor does it explicitly prohibit the launching of weapons from Earth to target an asset in outer space, or the use of outer space for certain hostile purposes directed at targets on Earth. Another relevant article of the Outer Space Treaty is Article 3, which stipulates that state parties to the treaty shall carry on activities in the exploration and use of outer space in accordance with international law and specifically the Charter of the United Nations. And from a security perspective, this is especially important because it makes the prohibition of the use of force or the threat of use of force, which is enshrined in Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, as applicable in the space domain, as well as any other obligations under international law that relate to security matters. Due to this Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty, they would also apply to space, even if they might have been conceived for, being applied on Earth. Beyond space-specific treaties, it should also be noted that there are other international agreements that, although they might not exclusively regulate space, they affect it and place limitations on the use of weapons therein. An example of this is the 1963 Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which prohibits the detonation of nuclear weapons in outer space. So this brings me back to the issue of why is space a disarmament concern or a disarmament issue? Space law is very focused on encouraging space exploration for peaceful purposes. So there are not many prohibitions, as I have just explained. These regulations that I just outlined still leave significant freedom of action for space actors to act in ways that could heighten tensions among competitors, which could eventually evolve into a conflict in outer space. An example of activities that heighten tensions is the development and use of counter-space technologies capable of disrupting and damaging space technology. Why is the potential loss of space technology such a worrisome prospect? Well, the answer is that the use of space has become so essential for humankind as a whole. Space assets, particularly service-oriented infrastructure, such as, let's say, global navigation satellite systems or Earth observation satellites, communication satellites as well, are capable of carrying out vast arrays of tasks that make many of the services that we rely on a day-to-day basis accessible to us. For example, satellites make navigation safe in the air, on land, and at sea. They also enable us the use of high-speed internet. They can control systems for energy grids, for water. They can control electronic financial transactions which enable us the use of things that we take for granted in our everyday lives, such as credit card payments or ATM usage. So space is thoroughly integrated in life on Earth in almost any imaginable purpose. Therefore, the loss of space infrastructure could mean the loss of critical services necessary for life on Earth, and hence why the international community has a vested interest in keeping it a peaceful and secure domain. There have been several multilateral processes that you should probably be aware of, some very recently and some that are actually currently happening as we speak. Over the years, the international community has made several efforts to address the matter of space security, with limited success, I have to say. But the notion of the prevention of an arms race in outer space, or PARIS for short, is commonly raised in diplomatic conversations surrounding disarmament and space. This notion of PARIS emerged in 1978, so it's been around for a significant amount of time. And since its emergence, it's been the primary objective of multilateral discussions on space security within the United Nations. As I said, featuring regularly in not just discussions among diplomats, but also in resolutions and in the mandates of working groups. There are several areas, however, where states have faced challenges and disagreements with one another. Examples of this are concerns over the potential space-based strike weapons versus Earth-based anti-satellite capabilities, also competing preferences for legally binding versus voluntary measures, and also difference in focuses on space weapons and how these should be defined, or whether we should be looking at behaviors instead of weapons or hardware itself. These divergent views have resulted in a bit of a stalemate. Nevertheless, over the years, there have been several initiatives and negotiations that have contributed in moving the discussion forward. Today, I'm going to highlight some of the ones that are the most relevant and that will probably come across in current conversations surrounding this topic. The first one that I want to highlight is a proposal for a draft treaty on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space, or PPWT for short, which was introduced in 2008 by the Russian Federation and China. This proposal laid out several articles that might be used in a legally binding instrument, including the undertaking of states not to place in orbit around the Earth any objects carrying any kinds of weapons. So this adds to the OST, not just prohibiting weapons of mass destruction in space, but also conventional weapons. This PPWT also aimed to encourage states not to resort to the threat or the use of force against outer space objects. In 2014, a new version of the draft of the PPWT was presented with amendments that sought to incorporate comments and to address concerns from certain states. However, it hasn't really progressed much since. Nevertheless, it's often raised in conversations among the diplomatic community, both in both informal and informal meetings, since it contains many interesting articles that states seek to implement in future initiatives. Also in 2008, a draft international code of conduct for outer space activities was proposed by the European Union. This was a voluntary instrument that had the objective of forming a regime of transparency and confidence building measures to complement existing regulations applicable to the outer space domain and to enhance safety, security, and sustainability for all outer space activities. A revised draft was released in 2014 following international consultations, but although the International Code of Conduct is often also brought up in conversations, both in formal and informal meetings in Geneva, it was not a document that was put before the CD. There have also been several groups of governmental experts regarding this issue. The most relevant ones are the one that took place in 2013 on transparency and confidence building measures for outer space activities, which actually managed to adopt a consensus report and a series of voluntary measures to reduce military tensions in space and to increase transparency. This included measures such as sharing information and notification of certain space activities. Following that GD, there was another one convened in 2018 and 2019 to identify issues and options to advance legally binding a legally binding instrument and powers. However, the group didn't manage to reach consensus on a final report of recommendations. But despite this, the work carried out by this group did highlight several points of convergence among states, such as the applicability of international law, in particular the Charter of the United Nations, to the outer space domain, and also the freedom of access to outer space without discrimination and on the basis of equality, as well as the need to avoid hampering the economic or technological development of states. More recently, and this is probably the most recent development that has happened in the space and disarmament field, which is currently very relevant because these conversations are actually happening nowadays, is the General Assembly Resolution 7536, which was adopted in 2020. The resolution is on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors. And this resolution called on states to submit views to the Secretary General on what activities could be considered responsible, irresponsible, or threatening. It initiated a process to further develop norms of responsible behavior for outer space activities, setting aside any focus on defining and regulating weapons in space. The objective was to reach a common understanding on how best to act to reduce threats to space systems in order to maintain outer space as a peaceful, safe, and sustainable domain. And also as a first step to formal discussions that could lead eventually to further considerations for a legally binding instrument in this area. That resolution that was adopted in 2020 was followed by a resolution last year. The resolution has the same name, although a different number. Its number is 76231. And it decided to convene an open-ended working group, which will be meeting during this year, 2022, or next year, 2023. And the objective of this open-ended working group is to take stock of existing international legal and normative frameworks concerning threats arising from state behaviors with respect to outer space. Also to consider current and future threats by states to space systems, and actions, activities, and omissions that could be considered irresponsible. Thirdly, to make recommendations on possible norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors relating to threats by states to space systems. And lastly, submitting a report to the submitting a report to the General Assembly at its 78th session. So this is the most recent initiative by states that is currently taking place at the UN in Geneva right now. To conclude, I'd like to stress that outer space is ever increasingly critical for humankind. Thus, ensuring that it remains a secure and peaceful domain is also critical. And in recent years, as what I've explained aims to show, it proves that states have a desire to reach a common understanding on matters related to space security. And it's necessary that such cooperation and willingness to exchange ideas continue so that the international community may achieve these goals of having a peaceful space domain free of weapons and free of tensions that could eventually lead to conflict in outer space.
Missiles actually, it's a fairly broad category, and if you try to define it, then I guess the better definition would be that this is an uncrewed guided weapon delivery vehicle. And normally when people talk about missiles, they mean ballistic missiles, but there are other type of missiles as well. For example, cruise missiles or some drones could be considered missiles. Or we have exotic things like hypersonic glide vehicles that also could be in that category. What makes missiles different from other delivery systems is, at least in the early days, they have this distinct advantage of being able to deliver their strike very quickly to large distances. And unlike bombers, they were invulnerable to air defenses, so they could penetrate air defense. Just to put it in perspective, for example, if we're talking about intercontinental distances of the order of 10,000 kilometers, then a bomber would require 10, 12, 14 hours to get to its target, and the missile could cover that distance in about 25, 30 minutes. So there is a significant difference here. Another advantage of missiles is that you can launch your strike from your own territory. You don't have to get close to the target. So you're basically firing from safety of your own state. And if you could build a long-range missile, then that means you could project your power or defend yourself from threats that are very far away from your country. And that definitely something that missiles, this is definitely the area where missiles have a distinct advantage. Another reason why missiles sort of occupy their own category in the international security discussion is that they're very firmly associated with weapons of mass destruction. And the reason for that is that, especially for ballistic missiles, if you try to build a missile that would have a fairly long range, then assuring that that missile is accurate enough is actually very difficult, and it is still difficult. that very much makes it unreasonable to use missiles, especially long-range missiles, with conventional payloads because they just don't have the accuracy that would be sufficient to any particular military purpose. However, missiles could still be used, and they have been used, in fact, with conventional payloads, but largely as weapons of intimidation or terror. And actually, you can look at the very first use of missiles back in during the World War II, when Nazi Germany used the very first cruise and ballistic missiles against Britain. So that association with weapons of mass destruction is definitely one of the reasons that missiles are getting attention. The situation is changing as far as accuracy is concerned, and missiles are getting more accurate, especially shorter range missiles, especially cruise missiles and things like drones. And we've seen they were used in a number of conflicts. But nevertheless, it's still, when you get to the intercontinental ranges, to the very long ranges, then they are still very firmly considered to be means of nuclear weapon delivery. The effort to curb the proliferation of missiles, to somehow contain the spread of missile technologies, began in the early days, and in the 80s, a group of states launched the International Regime Missile Technology Control Regime, or MTCR, that actually is designed to contain the spread of the technologies at the time, and it was largely the proliferation of technology from the holders, from the major missile producers, to other states that was considered to be the main threat to international security. And to a large extent, that regime was successful in the sense that there are 30 plus states that participate in the regime, and there are a number of others, major missile producers that follow the guidelines voluntarily. On the other hand, we have now seen that even though it is still rocket science, it's still a difficult technical enterprise, we've seen a number of states developing their own indigenous missile technologies, and that we've seen states developing ballistic missiles, and that is certainly true for cruise missiles as well. And in fact, we've seen private companies being in the space launch business, and some of those space launchers actually are very close to true ICBMs. And so we've seen, we've already seen, and we will probably see in the future, that the technological barriers are eroding, and that's definitely something that the international community should pay attention to. Another mechanism that regulates ballistic missiles is the Hague Code of Conduct. That is also a voluntary mechanism, and it commits its members to providing greater transparency in regarding their ballistic missiles program. For example, the members commit to provide notifications of their ballistic missile launches and their space launches, and also provide annual declaration of their ballistic missile activities. The HCOC is not an export control measure. It is a transparency and confidence building mechanism and it has a greater participation than MTCR, although it's not universal yet. But nevertheless, it is open for new participants, and this is one of the mechanisms that actually can be a building block of a regime that would at least provide transparency in the ballistic missile field. Proliferation of missile technologies to new states is not the only problem that we see today. We also see development of new types of missiles, new types of weapon delivery systems in states like Russia or the United States or China, and we can see that process actually, if not accelerating, but at least progressing further and further. And some of these technologies are fairly exotic. For example, there is a lot of attention these days to what is called the hypersonic missiles, and this is another category of missiles. And but normally these are what is called hypersonic glide vehicles, which operate sort of almost like a missile, but with a sort of the delivery vehicle travels through the atmosphere. The idea is that it would deliver its strike faster, and it could circumvent missile defenses. So we are back to where the missiles actually started. The problem with this kind of development is not necessarily that we will see a massive deployment of this kind of gliders. The problem, of course, is that these systems are not included in any of the current arms control agreements, and therefore their developments are not constrained by any understanding between the states that develop them. These are still, in my view, systems that provide a very niche capabilities, and we will not see a massive deployment of hypersonic gliders. But they could be enough of a factor that would destabilize the traditional arms control process, or at least very will complicate it in a very significant way. So we will see that development in the near future. When we talk about missiles, I think it is also very important to talk about missile defense, because again, if we look at the origins of the technology and its importance for strategic competition and for military operations, the idea, one of the characteristics of a missile is that it is not it cannot be intercepted by traditional air defenses. And this is why we've seen from the very early days, we've seen an effort to build defense against missiles. And this effort actually goes back to the 50s, and it's still going on. The hope is that that one day one could build a missile defense that could protect the state from a missile strike. The problem, of course, is that, and it is very well known, is that it's very much impossible to build a missile defense that would be able to pose any serious threat or that could counter any serious missile attack, or even a non-serious missile attack, even an attack with a single missile or a few missiles. There is virtually impossible to build a defense that could provide you with a sufficient guarantee of protection. Nevertheless, the effort continues. The problem with missile defense is that it encourages the development of new missiles, and this is the dynamic that we've seen in the past, in the 60s and then in the 80s. You see the kind of waves of enthusiasm about defenses. But the problem is that missile defense can work, but it can only work against missiles that don't exist. Once missile defense considers the actual missiles that are there that it is supposed to counter, then any politician, any military planner would quickly realize that actual missile defense offers no protection. But the problem is that by that time you have more missiles around, and that cycle could continue again and again. And right now we are probably in that cycle where people are pushing for more defenses, but since there are no missiles out there that these defenses would have to counter in a serious way, we see that there is still a bit of enthusiasm about missile defense capabilities.